Hey everybody, this is Chapter 6 of Adorno's Critique of Political Economy by Dirk Braunstein. It's titled Hatched, a National Economic, parenthesis, end parenthesis, theory. And it starts with a quote, the first progress was out of paradise, end quote, Albert Fabry in Zetza. Section 1. What has become of the proletariat? Already in a letter to Horkheimer from November 1936, Adorno reveals what strikes Adorno as, quote, the most important task towards which the Institute should put the theory of dialectical materialism to use, namely a theoretical analysis of the contemporary situation of class struggle, end quote. Prompted by his collaboration with Horkheimer on their work Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno would take up this task himself in 1942, penning a set of theses later published under the title Reflections on Class Theory. Earlier that same year, Horkheimer and Adorno composed a 4-page Memorandum über Teile des Los Angeles Arbeitsprogramms, die von den Philosophen nicht durchgeführt werden können. Memorandum on the parts of the Los Angeles program of work which cannot be carried out by the philosophers. A request addressed to the economists of the Institute for Social Research for assistance with their work in progress, Dialectic of Enlightenment. This brief text provides insights into precisely those economic questions which its authors saw as being, quote, related to the theory of class, end quote, and apparently felt unable to answer themselves. Only shortly beforehand, Horkheimer suggested to Felix Weil that he and Pollock take over the economic portion of Dialectic of Enlightenment. Quote, in this I was thinking that Fritz and you should, in the future, work here for at least 4 or 5 months out of the year and the rest of the year in New York, with the intention that this longer portion of the year will be used to work on our theoretical agenda. Here you would participate in the determination and structuring of the major parts. There you'd work on the economic sections in detail so that, after a few years, our interpretation of the current phase will be completed. It is, of course, nonsense to think that I could lend the project the necessary precision and concreteness, even in cooperation with Teddy. It has to be stuffed to the bursting point with historical and economic material, otherwise it will give the impression of being speculation, end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Felix Weil, 10th of March, 1942. Adorno and Horkheimer's memorandum begins with a series of questions. Quote, what has become of the proletariat in the monopolistic fascist phase? Can the proletariat still be defined as the proletariat is in capital, Marxist capital? What effect has monopolization had on distinctions within the proletariat? To what extent do changes in these distinctions mean changes in class consciousness and in the structure and role of the party, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. The question of what has happened to the proletariat, a question Adorno would later describe in Minima Moralia as a, quote, grimly comic riddle, end quote, for sociologists, is taken up by Horkheimer at least as early as his 1937 article, Traditional and Critical Theory, which is on this channel. According to Burkhard Lindner, so maybe the Lindner that I was talking about in subsequent chapters wasn't Urs Lindner, but this Burkhard Lindner. According to Burkhard Lindner, in addition to presenting, quote, exchange as an epistemological category, end quote, this essay by the future co-author of Dialectic of Enlightenment cites, quote, the class relation as the, quote, basic economic structure, end quote, of all social change, yet no longer in view of the organized proletariat, end quote. Burkhard Lindner. In a passage clearly motivated by, quote, the revolution's failure even where it succeeded, end quote, Adorno. Horkheimer writes the following, quote, the idea of a transformed society, does not have the advantage of widespread acceptance, as long as the idea has not yet had its real possibility tested. To strive for a state of affairs in which there will be no exploitation or oppression, in which an all-embracing subject, namely self-aware mankind, exists, and in which it is possible to speak of a united theoretical creation and a thinking that transcends individuals, to strive for all this is not yet to bring it to pass. The transmission of the critical theory, in its strictest possible form, is, of course, a condition for its historical success. But the transmission will not take place via solidly established practice and fixed ways of acting, but via concern for social transformation. Such a concern will necessarily be aroused ever anew by prevailing injustice, but it must be shaped and guided by the theory itself, and in turn react upon the theory. The circle of transmitters of this tradition is neither limited nor renewed by organic or sociological laws. It is constituted and maintained not by biological or testamentary inheritance, but by a knowledge which brings its own obligations with it. And even this knowledge guarantees only a contemporary, not a future community of transmitters. The theory may be stamped with the approval of every logical criterion, but to the end of the age it will lack the seal of approval which victory brings. Until then, too, the struggle will continue to grasp it aright and to apply it. A version of it which has the propaganda apparatus and a majority on its side is not therefore the better one. In the general historical upheaval, the truth may reside with numerically small groups of men. History teaches us that such groups, hardly noticed even by those opposed to the status quo, outlawed but imperturbable, may at the decisive moment become the leaders because of their deeper insight. End quote. Horkheimer. Footnote. In a letter to Pollock from the same year, Horkheimer writes the following, quote, the few people in whom the truth has taken refuge appear as ridiculous dogmatists who speak a bombastic language with nothing to back them up. The consolation that things were the same for certain figures in the Old Testament is all the less helpful given that the success of the prophets was not exactly overwhelming in the long run. The most unpleasant discovery to which materialism leads is that reason only exists insofar as reason is backed up by a natural subject. The subject possesses reason according to how it wants to make use of reason. It can also lose reason through no fault of its own. The retroactive effect of reason on the subject is never so intense and sustained that the subject would lose its natural character. In other words, that famous identity from which idealism lives never comes into being. Of course, as far as is possible, we must attempt to produce this identity, but ultimately there will be waters over which no spirit hovers. End quote. Letter from a Horkheimer to Pollock, 20th September 1937. End footnote. Adorno develops a similar idea in a 1941 letter to Edward M. David, the English translator of his essay on Oswald Spengler, while clarifying the meaning of a passage of that text. Quote, the non-identical element must not be nature alone, it also can be men. The German reads, Freiheit entfaltet sich bloß am Widerstand des Seienden, wird sie absolut Gesetz und das Selentum zum herrschenden Weltprinzip erhoben, so verfällt es selber dem bloßen Dasein. Freedom unfolds merely in resistance to what is. If freedom is made absolute and the life of the soul elevated to a reigning universal principle, then freedom itself falls victim to mere existence. I have inserted one sentence later, quote, freedom postulates the existence of something non-identical, end quote. I hope this makes the meaning clearer. End quote. Letter from Adorno to David, 30th of July, 1941. See Vigerhaus and see Clausen. This correspondence reveals that Adorno did not intend, quote, must not be, end quote, in the sense of, quote, is not allowed to be, end quote, but in the sense of, quote, does not have to be, end quote. In the English version of Adorno's essay on Spengler, published shortly thereafter, the passage reads, quote, what we may call the freedom of man consists only in the human attempt to break the rule imposed by nature. It is, if that is ignored and the historical world is made a mere product of human essence, freedom will be lost in the resulting all humanity of history. Freedom postulates the existence of something non-identical. End quote. Adorno. Just as the status of the proletariat changed under monopoly capitalism, so too that of the capitalist class. In a subsequent section of their memorandum, Adorno and Horkheimer asked the following, quote, what has become of the capitalist class? To what extent today is the capitalist class nationally and internationally unified? Relationship of trade, finance, heavy industry, and manufacturing industry. Which changes has capitalist class consciousness undergone, and how do capitalists relate to dominant ideologies such as individualism and collectivism? End quote. Horkheimer and Adorno. Adorno and Horkheimer also inquire about the, quote, bureaucracy as a potential third class. Quote, we should arrive at a concrete position on the contemporary controversy. This probably requires tracing bureaucratization back to bureaucratization's various roots, civil service, the corporation, etc. Particular attention is to be paid to the problem of separation or fusion of ownership titles and discretionary power. Emphasis will continue to be placed on the influence of technical changes, on the transition from immediate to mediated domination. The factory turns from a business into an institution complex with its own, quote, form of life, end quote, consciously created, quote, community, end quote, fraternal mythology and hierarchy, supervisory role of the manager in various cultural areas, end quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. Footnote. The memorandum, and not as assumed by the editors of Horkheimer's collected works, the essay On the Sociology of Class Relations, appears to be the text which, in a letter to Pollock from the 21st of April 1942, Horkheimer says he will send to the latter in a few weeks. In this letter, Horkheimer writes the following regarding the problems involved with dialectic of enlightenment. Quote, I think that these problems will be close enough to your own theoretical concerns. As far as I can see now, they are mostly related to the problem of classes. Which changes have taken place in the structure of the well-to-do classes as well as among the workers and unemployed in the last decades? Is it still possible to speak of the, quote, proletariat, end quote, in the sense it played a role in the old theories? What does bureaucracy in the modern sense really mean? How did it come about? And what is its real function? End quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Pollock, 21st of April, 1942. End footnote. A further question refers to the contemporary state of Marxist discussion. Quote, what is the state of the academic and extra-academic discussion of Marxist theory? It would be extremely important to first gain an overview which could then be critically assessed. What is the status of important trade union leaders in Marxist and non-Marxist theory? Have there been any advances in Marxist Have there been any advances in Marxist economics which deserve to be taken seriously? Which other important theorems should be considered today? End quote. Adorno and Horkheimer. The section following this one provides a glimpse into Adorno's search for material for his essay titled The Schema of Mass Culture and for the Culture Industry chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment. Quote, one question relatively separate from the above question refers to the immediate control of mass culture by monopoly. It would be extremely important for the work to have a clear picture of the economic and personal mechanisms of control through which each of the important spheres in the cultivation of the next generation is regulated. This is quite easy to determine for film, but essential data should also be compiled for other areas: radio, newspapers, magazines, universities, and scholarly foundations. This also includes the interconnections between the individual branches of the culture industries. End quote. Adorno and Horkheimer, Memorandum. No deeper knowledge of the standard work practices at the Institute for Social Research is needed to recognize that the memorandum, assuming it was distributed among the Institute's employees as planned, could not have had its intended effect. No responses have been found at any rate. Rolf Wiggershaus suspects that this was due not least to the manner in which it was written. While the memorandum, quote, made it clear that Horkheimer was still convinced of the necessity of interdisciplinary collaboration, it remained unclear in what sense, quote, interdisciplinary collaboration, end quote, was intended, end quote. Wiggershaus. For this reason, Adorno would subsequently tackle some of the problems which were, quote, particularly close to our, bracket, his and Horkheimer's, and bracket, hearts, end quote, on his own. Regarding his paper, Reflections on Class Theory, which would first appear in his posthumously published collected works in May 1971, Adorno writes to his parents in September 1942 that he has, quote, hatched a national economic, exclamation point, end parenthesis, theory in order to bring Marx's doctrine of, bracket, pauperization, in bracket, up to date, end quote. 2 weeks later, Adorno gives Horkheimer a similar update. Quote, otherwise, I have worked on the theoretical aspect and written new, quote, reflections on class theory, end quote, which are partially formulations of common things with a view towards the theory of the racket, and partially formulations of entirely new ones. This manuscript is constructed so that it will be able to be assimilated into the work as is, taken up as needed in entirely different passages of the final product. A paragraph about pauperization and one about formal sociology are also included. Footnote: letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 15th of September 1942. According to Gide and Lonitz, at the time, Horkheimer and Adorno were planning a, quote, sociology of the racket, end quote, which they wanted to elaborate with Grossman, Löwenthal, Pollack, and Weil, and Horkheimer and Adorno apparently also considered devoting a part of this work to the transformation of capitalism and the resulting critique of the concept of class society. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, such motifs are located in the chapter titled The Concept of Enlightenment, and in the two excursus. The following year, Horkheimer wrote his essay titled On the Sociology of Class Relations, end quote. Horkheimer wrote his essay on the sociology of class relations, end quote. Gide and Lonitz. For Horkheimer's essay, see Horkheimer 2016. In a letter from later that same month, Horkheimer suggests to Adorno that after finishing Dialectic of Enlightenment, they, quote, should do some work in connection with the economic projects, parenthesis, sociology of rackets, end parenthesis. Very soon in the new year, we should start either with what you wrote on mass culture or with some other subject with which we can proceed a little faster than with our first paragraphs, end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 17th of September, 1942. End footnote. Section 2. Now they are united. The quote, the article, Reflections on Class Theory, Adorno, quote, hatched, represent a transition, and by no means only in a temporal sense, from the debate on state capitalism at the Institute and in the Zeitschrift for Sozialforschung towards dialectic of enlightenment. Footnote, quote, "It is in any case unthinkable that the article Reflections on Class Theory would have come about if not for Horkheimer's studies for the article The Jews and Europe, the Authoritarian State, and the End of Reason." End quote. Breuer. Indeed, Horkheimer and Adorno take up several theses of the, quote, reflections in the final product, Dialectic of Enlightenment, albeit in a thoroughly modified and usually less economy-critical form, and while eschewing any and all explicit reference to Marx. The former text, quote, in many respects provides the key, end quote, to the latter. Muntz-Kuhnen, 1997. Footnote. The, quote, reflections provide the key for understanding not only the refusal of utopia in Dialectic of Enlightenment, but also Dialectic of Enlightenment's economy-critical implications. End footnote. The treatment of pauperization theory Adorno mentions in the letters to his parents and Horkheimer constitutes only one section of the Reflections article, in which Adorno refers directly the Communist Manifesto and its militant conclusion, quote, "Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win." End quote. Marx and Engels. Communist Manifesto. From Adorno's perspective, just under a century after those words were written, the proletariat seems to hardly resemble how it had been depicted in them. Quote, "The proletariat does have more to lose than its chains, ... Shorter working hours, better food, housing, and clothing, protection for family members and for the worker in his old age, an average increase in life expectancy. All these things have come to the workers with the development of the technical forces of production. There can be no question of their being driven by hunger to join forces and make a revolution," end quote. Adorno. Adorno believes that the integration of the proletariat in the absence of revolution had cast, quote, "a dubious light," end quote, on the Marxian theory of history, which is summarized in the third volume of Capital as follows. Quote, "Each particular historical form of this process further develops the material foundations and social forms. Once a certain level of maturity is attained, the particular historical form is shed and makes way for a higher form. The sign that the moment of such a crisis has arrived is that the contradiction and antithesis between, on the one hand, the relations of distribution, hence also the specific historical form of relations of production corresponding to them, and, on the other hand, the productive forces, productivity, and the development of its agents gains in breadth and depth." Unquote. Marx. In retrospect, Adorno is left to conclude that the development of the forces of production have, quote, "had the opposite effect of the Marxian prognosis and led to an increase in worker living standards," end quote. Kager, 1988, or Kager, 1988. Quote, "Marx's insight that the system produces the proletariat has been fulfilled on a scale that was absolutely unforeseeable. By virtue of their needs and the omnipresent requirements of the system, men have truly become its products. Under the monopoly system, the process of dehumanization is perfected on the backs of the civilized as an all-encompassing reification, not as a naked coercion. Indeed, this dehumanization is what that civilization is. The totalizing character of society proves itself in the fact that it does not just take utter possession of its members, but creates its members in its own image," end quote. Adorno. However, Adorno believes that the dehumanizing effects of capitalist civilization apply not only to the proletariat but to all members of society in equal measure. to capitalists and intellectuals, to the dominant and the dominated. Quote, pauperization does exist to the degree that the bourgeois class really is an anonymous and unconscious class, and that both it and the proletariat are dominated by the system, end quote. This, quote, blind system is the domination itself, end quote. Adorno. In its incessant reproduction, it is one and the same with domination. As Adorno remarks in a note from 1943, quote, if I were to sum up in one sentence the secret of both contemporary monopolistic and totalitarian society, I would say that today the apparatus of life's reproduction directly coincides with the apparatus of its domination, end quote. Adorno. The integration of the proletariat is a negative integration. Rather than being achieved by workers overcoming the class antagonism with the help of a revolutionary class consciousness forged through collective misery, it came about when those who had more to lose than their chains became equally as organized through this class relation as the class struggle itself. Meanwhile, class struggle has been confined to limits set by capital in the interest of capital's own continued existence. Quote, the immeasurable pressure of domination has so fragmented the masses that it has even dissipated the negative unity of being oppressed that forged them into a class in the 19th century. In exchange, they find they have been directly absorbed into the unity of the system that is oppressing them. Class rule is set to survive the anonymous objective form of class, end quote. Adorno. Unity among proletarians was thus established as a negation of a negation, yet one with no positive upshot. After all, society under capital reproduces itself reproduces itself seems like there's supposed to be a word there. So it seems like it's supposed to say no more. So I'm going to read it how I think it's supposed to be said. After all, society under capital reproduces itself no more differently than it did so before. Oh, Jesus Christ. Never mind, I'm a fucking idiot. After all, society under capital reproduces itself no differently than society under capitalism did so before. Social reproduction still occurs under coercion from authority. Quote, hierarchy had always been a coercive organization designed for the appropriation of the labor of others. Natural law, quote, here, quote, natural, ironically, refers to the appearance of naturalness, which is, quote, both in actuality and at the same time a socially necessary illusion, end quote. Adorno. Quote, is historical injustice that has become obsolete. The articulated organism is a system of divisiveness, end quote. Adorno. In this respect, as long as society itself has existed, so too have there been classes, not in the Marxian sense of groups defined by their control or lack thereof over the means of production, but in the sense of sorting of society into the dominant and dominated. However, only under capitalism does the evidence of domination dissolve, yielding the apparent, quote, classless society of car drivers, cinema goers, and Volksgenossen, end quote. Footnote. Translator's note. The term, quote, Volksgenosse, compatriot, or more literally, national or racial comrade, came to be associated with National Socialism. Rodney Livingstone translates the term here simply as, quote, comrade, end quote, which entirely erases the allusion to National Socialism, end quote. End footnote. Quote, proletarians of all countries unite. Now they are united, but that does not mean anything other than that the significance of the Marxian proposition has been superseded, end quote. Adorno. In his theses, Adorno reflects on how economic pauperization has largely failed to materialize, whereas a pauperization of the individual has triumphed completely, a thesis which would be developed in Minima Moralia. Additionally, Adorno also visits a subject he addressed in the article on the social situation of music, namely the Lukashian false absolutization of proletarian class consciousness as a phenomenon, quote, to be understood positively here and now, end quote. Adorno. Although Adorno still espouses the concept of class in the Reflections article, given that it, quote, its basis, the division of society into exploiters and exploited, not only continues unabated but is increasing in coercion and solidity, end quote, Adorno. Adorno abandons the assumption of a proletarian class consciousness, arguing that, quote, the oppressed who today, as predicted by the Marxian theory, constitute the overwhelming majority of mankind, are unable to experience themselves as a class, end quote, Adorno. For this reason, Adorno claims, quote, membership in the same class by no means translates into equality of interest and action, end quote, Adorno. And, quote, the idea that the oppressed, the workers of the world, might unite as a class and put an end to the horror seems doomed in the light of present distribution of power and impotence, end quote, Adorno. According to Adorno, under monopoly capitalism, quote, the untrue aspect of the concept of class, end quote, that is, the impossibility of an overarching proletarian self-consciousness, has become visible. Yet at the same time, the objective persistence of classes has been made, quote, virtually invisible, end quote. Quote, bourgeois sociology of all nations, end quote, no longer recognizes their existence. Apparently against Karl Mannheim, Adorno continues as follows, quote, the skepticism toward the so-called metaphysics of class becomes the norm in the realm of formal sociology. Classes are said not to exist because of the unshakable facts. The facts are unshakable because the facts are made to take the place of class. And wherever the sociological gaze seeks the stones of class, the sociological gaze discovers only the bread of the elites and learns daily that you simply cannot dispense with ideology. And since sociology always acts in this way, the cleverest thing sociology can do is to leave the forms of socialization unscathed, and perhaps with bleeding heart, adopt the cause of the unavoidable elite as one's own ideology, end quote. Adorno. Section 3, handout. A meta-economic precondition of the existence of classes is the validity of the, quote, principle of sovereign ownership, end quote, as well as the, quote, law of the exchanges of equivalence, end quote. Although classes exist objectively, classes are quote, also ideology in equal measure, end quote. Adorno. As far as their function is concerned, given the social condition of possibility on which classes are based, the extremely long-standing validity of the ownership and equivalence principles is effaced by their objective existence. Footnote. This does not mean that pre-capitalist exchanges were equivalent, but rather that the principle of equivalence, as a stipulated means of quantifying equality for different quantities, is at least as old as the oldest records from ancient history. Quote, counting, measurement, and calculation are a universal language used by man in his interaction with nature and his own. With them he links part and whole. He had already discovered, quote, quantizing during the time from which we have access to archaeological traces, but no textual sources. The facts and findings from the study of measurements prehistory help us to understand that the first texts on measurement from the epoch of early high cultures are themselves based on several millennia of oral and material practical tradition, end quote. Haustein, 2004, end footnote. Subordinated to capital, the law of exchange of equivalence derives its legitimacy from the liberal principle of justice. However, according to Adorno, if the Marxian critical theory, quote, shows that there is something questionable about the idea of fair exchange, bourgeois freedom, and humanity, This sheds light on the dual nature of the class. This duality consists in the fact that its formal equality has the function both of oppressing the class with which it is contrasted and of using the strongest to control members of its own. End quote. Adorno. Adorno's claim here echoes Marx and Engels' portrayal of class in the German ideology as, quote, the negative unity of all of its individuals, end quote. A portrayal which suggests that, quote, class struggle should not be fetishized, but rather that classes should be abolished, end quote. Blumentritt, 1992. Quote, separate individuals form a class only insofar as separate individuals have to carry on a common battle against another class. In other respects, they are on hostile terms with each other as competitors, end quote. Marx and Engels. In reality, the alleged novelty introduced by capitalism with its specific form of class domination is merely the continuation of domination's triumphant history. Adorno believes that, quote, theory's prognosis of a few owners and an overwhelming mass of the expropriate has come true, but instead of becoming glaringly obvious, this has been conjured out of existence by the mass society in which class society has culminated. The ruling class disappears behind the concentration of capital. This latter has reached a magnitude and acquired a weight of its own that enables capital to present itself as an institution, as the expression of society as a whole. By virtue of its omnipotence, the particular is able to usurp the totality. This overall social aspect of capital is the endpoint of the old fetish character of the commodity, according to which relations between men are reflected back to men as relations between things. Today, the entire order of existence has turned into such things. End quote. Adorno. However, rather than conclude from this that class domination, blind and indifferent to the individual, always asserts itself quasi-naturally through the capital relation, Adorno sees class formation, that is, the formation of class consciousness, is, quote, closed off by the conscious will and practical measures of the rulers in the name of the great totality, bracket, which they themselves are, end bracket, end quote. Adorno. Adorno recognizes one such practical measure necessary for preventing the material pauperization of the proletariat in a, quote, extra economic improvement of the standard of living, end quote, through an irregular, quote, handout, end quote, Trinkgeld, from the rulers, paid not as part of one's salary, but rather, quote, out of income or monopoly profits, end quote. The dynamics of poverty are brought to a halt by the process of accumulation. The improvement or stabilization of the economic situation of the lower classes is extra economic, end quote. I think I might have misread that. I think I missed a quote. Quote, the dynamics of poverty are brought to a halt by the process of accumulation. The improvement or stabilization of the economic situation of the lower classes is extra economic, end quote. Adorno. This is to say that the ruling class had made the economic stabilization of the working class its own private concern, albeit certainly not out of kindness. Quote, goodwill and psychology have nothing to do with it, end quote. Adorno. Rather, the ruling class ultimately has to provide for workers, the sole guarantee of the ruling class's own existence. The ruling class has to, quote, secure for the slaves their existence within slavery, end quote, in order to consolidate the ruling class's own existence, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. This dynamic was described in the Communist Manifesto, quote, and here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society and to impose the bourgeoisie's conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. The bourgeoisie is unfit to rule because the bourgeoisie is incompetent to assure an existence to the bourgeoisie's slave within his slavery. Because the bourgeoisie cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. End quote. Marx and Engels. Here, Adorno largely follows Horkheimer's considerations in the authoritarian state article. Quote, the institutionalization of the top ranks of capital and labor have the same basis, the change in the means of production. Monopolized industry, which makes the mass of stockholders into victims and parasites, pushes the masses of workers into supporting passivity. They have more to expect from the protection and assistance of the organizations than from their work. End quote. Horkheimer. End footnote. In this phase of capitalism, Adorno sees the organization of work, the double negative unity of proletarians of all countries, not merely as the consequence of a fated triumph of the capital relation or its blind automatic adaptation to contemporary challenges to its continued existence, but rather as the deliberate maintenance of domination by the dominant. Given that not even members of the ruling class are secure in their status as such, they too must maintain the class antagonism which makes others workers and themselves non-workers. According to Adorno, this, quote, process of liquidating the economy, end quote, does not lead to state capitalism. Instead, Adorno sees it as helping monopoly capitalism become completely established for the first time, resulting in both the greatest possible standardization of the economic sphere, of the process of production and of compulsion, as well as of the formerly extra-economic sphere, that is, of culture in the broadest sense. In this way, the liquidation of the economy leads to everything, including life itself, becoming the economy. Section 4, as in myth. Quote, according to the theory, end quote, Marxian theory that is, quote, history is the history of class struggles, but the concept of class is bound up with the emergence of the proletariat, end quote. Adorno. Because the proletariat is the first class able to experience itself as a class. History up to the present is the history of the dominant and the dominated. Quote, the archaic silence of pyramids and ruins becomes conscious of itself in materialist thought. It is the echo of factory noise in the landscape of the immutable. End quote. Adorno. The hardship of the proletariat as an exploited class is seen by Adorno as a modern counterpart to the grinding down of humans which enabled the construction of monumental grave sites for the rulers of ancient Egypt. This suggests that while it is impossible to trace a universal history from past to present, it is certainly possible to trace the emergence of the class antagonism as the highest stage which perpetual domination has reached thus far. Quote, no universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is a universal history leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. End quote. Adorno. From the insight, Adorno draws consequences for the view of all previous history as a, quote, prehistory, end quote, which as a history of domination is both ancient and still current. Quote, by exposing the historical necessity that had brought capitalism into being, bracket, the critique of, end bracket, political economy became the critique of history as a whole, whose immutable nature was the source of the privileged status of capitalism as well as its forebears. To recognize the catastrophic violence in the latest form of injustice, that is to say, the latest injustice contained in fair exchange, means simply to identify it with the prehistory that it destroyed, end quote. Adorno. Much later on, in aesthetic theory, Adorno would take up this idea again. Quote, social antagonisms are as old as the hills, only prematurely did they become class struggles, where market economies related to bourgeois society began to take shape. For this reason, the interpretation of everything historical as class struggle has a slight anachronistic air, just as the model of Marx's constructions and extrapolations was that of liberal entrepreneurial capitalism, end quote. Adorno. The description of history as the history of class struggles ontologizes history as what, quote, was always the same, end quote, statically defining it as what has been until now, as what Marx himself terms prehistory, quote, with a kind of hope born of despair, end quote. However, this always still current prehistory is, quote, no less than the entire stretch of bracket known and bracket history, the realm of bondage, end quote, Adorno. Its, quote, forms and structures, end quote, are, quote, eternally transitory because as blind products of nature, they are subject to natural decay. Marx's dialectic includes, therefore, a doctrine of invariance, a negative ontology of society which advances through internal conflict. Bracket society's dynamism, the energetic dissonance, the antagonism is its stasis, is what has not changed at all until today, and what has caused every relation of production to spoil, in bracket. The urge to expand, to absorb more and more, bracket, new sectors, in bracket, and to leave out less and less, had so far remained static or invariant. In this way, bracket, fate continues to reproduce itself to avoid being destroyed. Each and every form of society unconsciously works towards its destruction, as well as the destruction of the whole that keeps itself alive within it, end bracket. This was, bracket, its, and bracket, eternity, bracket, progress, which Marx claims brought prehistory to an end, would be the end of this dynamic, which becomes entangled with stasis according to its own contradictory substance. A right society would transcend both, end bracket. It, bracket, would, end bracket, not seek to preserve what, bracket, merely exists, end bracket, to tie men down for the sake of order, bracket, which would no longer need such ties as soon as it became united with the interest of humanity, end bracket. Nor, bracket, would, end bracket, it seek to perpetuate blind, bracket, movement, end bracket, which is the opposite of Kant's aim of history, eternal peace. End quote, Adorno. The interpretation of previous history as, quote, prehistory, end quote, occurs throughout Marx's work and probably most explicitly in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. Quote, the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of social process of production. Antagonistic not in the sense of individual antagonism, singular, but of an antagonism that emanates from the individual's social conditions of existence. But the productive forces developing within bourgeois society create also the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism. The prehistory of human society accordingly closes with this social formation. End quote. Marx. By ascribing to it the status of a natural law, some are dominated by others, that is just the way of the world, the particular injustice of the ruling class becomes flattened. In this way, real history becomes the tireless proclaimer of, quote, of the unspeakable commandment to submit, end quote. Adorno. Quote, the widely lamented immaturity of the masses simply reflects the fact that the masses are now no more the autonomous masters of their lives than they ever were. They are now more the autonomous... Let me repeat that. Quote, the widely lamented immaturity of the masses simply reflects the fact that they are now no more the autonomous masters of their lives than they ever were. As in myth, their lives befall them like fate, unquote. I like that. Come on. Where am I? And from today's perspective, only once history indeed can not be deciphered as anything other than a constantly regenerating prehistory whose expression is, quote, revealed in conditions and things, end quote. However, these might become manifest, quote, as the trace of former suffering, end quote. Does the conceptualization of history as the history of class struggles have an element of truth? On this point, Adorno is able to follow Marx's understanding of history as expressed in an often cited comment from the Methods chapter of the Grundrisse. Quote, human anatomy contains a key to the anatomy of the ape. The intimations of higher development among the subordinates and animal species, however, can be understood only after the higher development is already known, end quote. Marx. Footnote. Quote, reflection on the forms of human life, hence also scientific analysis of those forms, takes a course directly opposite to their real development. Reflection begins post festum, and therefore the results of the process of development ready to hand, end quote. Marx. Quote, in contrast, genetic reconstruction, understood as a model representation of history, would amount to declaring the anatomy of the ape as the key to the anatomy of the human, end quote. Heinrich. End footnote. In a 1967 seminar, Adorno would claim that Marx, quote, conceives of the whole of history from history's beginning and projected the antagonistic structure of bourgeois society onto pre-capitalist history, end quote, in order to, quote, show that domination could only be deduced from the vital process of society, end quote. Adorno. If this is so, it can also be claimed that Adorno himself conceives of history as the history of suffering, believing that the key to power relations of the past must be sought in the current way in which humans dominate each other in nature. Quote, from the most recent form of injustice, a steady light reflects back on history as a whole, end quote. Adorno. This whole, the course of history thus far, radiant with injustice as the, quote, persistent suffering of humanity, end quote, just as the, quote, wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity, end quote. Adorno. As Horkheimer remarks incisively in a letter to Adorno from May 1949, quote, humans must compel humans to compel nature, otherwise nature compels humans. This is the concept of society, end quote. Letter from Horkheimer to Adorno, 8th of May 1949. And this means of every society which has existed, quote, the irreconcilable power of the negative that sets history in motion is the power of what exploiters do to the victims. As a shackle binding one generation to the next, it functions as an obstacle to both freedom and history, end quote. Adorno. History has, just like progress, quote, so far failed to take place, end quote. Adorno. What appears as progress is deciphered by Adorno as the eternal return of the, quote, old terror, end quote, in the figure of the novel and cutting edge, of the myth under which the entirety of the Enlightenment was still spellbound, and which consists of, quote, that blind continuum of time that continually retracts itself, end quote. Adorno. Footnote. See the following passage from the text titled Imperial Panorama in Benjamin's One-Way Street. Quote, a curious paradox. People have only the narrowest private interest in mind when they act, yet they are at the same time more than ever determined in their behavior by the instincts of the mass. And mass instincts have become confused and estranged from life more than ever. Whereas the obscure impulse of the animal, as innumerable anecdotes relate, detects, as danger approaches, a way of escape and still seems invisible. This society, each of whose members cares only for his own abject well-being, falls victim. With animal insensibility, but without the insensate intuition of animals, as a blind mass, to even the most obvious danger, and the diversity of individual goals is immaterial in face of the identity of the determining forces. Again and again it has been shown that society's attachment to its familiar and long since forfeited life is so rigid as to nullify the genuinely human application of intellect, forethought, even in dire peril, so that in this society the picture of imbecility is complete. Uncertainty, indeed perversion, of vital instincts, and impotence, indeed decay of the intellect. This is the condition of the entire German bourgeoisie, end quote. Walter Benjamin. End footnote. The dynamism of Marxism, for which, quote, members of the bourgeoisie and their supporters, end quote, have at times, quote, been loud in their praise, end quote, is a dynamism with inconstant sameness. It accomplishes nothing new by itself. Quote, the new does not add itself to the old, but remains the old in distress, end quote. Adorno. As long as, quote, the ever new is also the old lying close at hand, end quote. Adorno. The whole course of history thus far, Adorno would later claim in his lecture course, History and Freedom, quote, is constructed like a gigantic process involving the exchange of cause and effect, end quote. And, quote, in this sense, history never escapes from the bonds of myth, end quote. Adorno. Instead, history is a, quote, vast analytic proposition, end quote, which always only validates that which, quote, exists in this manner and not in any other, end quote. Adorno. This manner of looking back at what has been, one which recognizes history's negative tendency towards degradation, calls, and certainly not by accident, Benjamin's, quote, historical philosophical theses, end quote, and especially his 10th thesis about the, quote, angel of history, end quote. Footnote. Benjamin's theses were published under the title On the Concept of History. While writing the article, Reflections on Class Theory, Adorno was already familiar with Benjamin's thesis. In a letter to Horkheimer from June 1941, he writes that he has received a copy of them from Hannah Arendt. See letter from Adorno to Horkheimer, 12th of June 1941. End footnote. The, quote, one single catastrophe, end quote, this angel recognizes in the, quote, chain of events appearing before us, end quote, is received by Adorno as well as Benjamin in the reduction of progress to methods of perfecting domination, a version of progress which, as nothing other than base myth, makes a mockery of its very concept. Footnote. Nietzsche already recognizes that, quote, progress often means progress in making things controllable. In a posthumous fragment cited by Adorno in the introduction to Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno in a posthumous fragment cited by Adorno in the introduction to Dialectic of Enlightenment, he writes the following, quote, Nietzsche writes the following, quote, spiritual enlightenment is an infallible means for making men unsure, weaker in will, so they are more in need of company and support. In short, for developing the herd animal in man. Therefore, all great artists of government, so far, Confucius in China, the Imperium Romanum, Napoleon, the papacy at the time when it took an interest in power, and not merely in the world, in the places where the dominant instincts have culminated so far, also employed spiritual enlightenment. At least let it have its way, like the popes of the Renaissance. The self-deception of the mass concerning this point, e.g. in every democracy, is extremely valuable. Making men smaller and more governable is desired as, quote, progress, end quote, Nietzsche, end footnote. Quote, within the sphere of influence of the system, the new, progress, is, like the old, a constant source of new disaster, end quote. Adorno. In one passage in the book, Composing for the Films, a book co-authored by Adorno and Hans Eisler in 1944, bourgeois music is described as follows, quote, on the one hand, bourgeois music is in a certain sense pre-capitalistic, quote, direct, end quote, a vague evocation of togetherness. On the other hand, because it has shared in the progress of civilization, it has become reified, indirect, and ultimately a, quote, means among many others, end quote. Adorno and Eisler. Yet manipulation no longer occurs deceptively and coercively as the instilling of ideologies in defenseless victims of domination. On the contrary, society itself has become its own ideology. Footnote, quote, ideology loses the very characteristic of being something conscious. It is said there is no dominant ideology anymore because homogeneous interests have dissolved and no particular interest presents itself as general. Power relations are taken as self-evident. While it is assumed that the remnants of former ideology could no longer count as such, the sorry state of society becomes ideology itself. This is because the conformity which it openly preaches makes unnecessary that ideology which was once supposed to cover up class oppositions, end quote. Demirovich, 1999, end footnote. Quote, in the name of realism, end quote, people acquiesce to coercion and misfortune, to the, quote, overwhelming power of the existing conditions, end quote, which come to be tolerated as normality, while it is assumed that things simply, quote, are the way they are, end quote. Adorno. As an instrument of implementing this, quote, downright morbidly reality addicted, end quote, fatalism, Adorno recognized that which he would shortly thereafter describe as the, quote, culture industry, end quote. Quote, domination becomes an integral part of human beings. Human beings do not want to be, quote, influenced, as liberals with their ideas of the market are wont to imagine. Shimmy, Jesus Christ. Quote, domination becomes an integral part of human beings. Human beings do not need to be, quote, influenced, as liberals with their ideas of the market are wont to imagine. Mass culture simply makes human beings, yet again, what they already are thanks to the coercion of the system. It keeps a watchful eye on the anomalies, introduces the official complement of practice in the shape of, quote, public morality, end quote, and provides people with models for imitation, end quote. Adorno. The calibration of the self-mastery of individuals to the domination imposed on them externally corresponds to the calibration between ideology and reality. Quote, however, because ideology and reality are converging in this manner, because reality, due to the lack of any other convincing ideology, becomes its own ideology, it requires only a small effort of mind to throw off this all-powerful and at the same time empty illusion. But to make this effort seems to be the most difficult thing of all. End quote. Adorno. Adorno regards it as possible that a domination which has become total would do away with itself. Quote, the power which openly admits its own irresistibility, end quote. Frank Buckelman writes in his study on Marx and Adorno, quote, lives off of the belief that openness could not be a lie. Yet to a society which de facto identifies with reality with appearance, freedom can only, quote, appear when masked as unfreedom, end quote. Buckelman. Where domination verges on totality, domination undermines its own condition of possibility, the existence of something external to it which can be dominated in the first place. Footnote, quote, the truth of ideology first disappears when domination no longer needs to deny its own existence and the function of false consciousness has become abstract, potentially expendable. Ideology degenerates into an imitation of that which exists either way, end quote. Buckelman, 1998. End footnote. Quote, dehumanization is also its opposite. In reified human beings, reification finds reification's outer limits. They catch up with the technical forces of production, in which the relations of production lie hidden. In this way, these relations lose the shock of their alien nature, because the alienation is so complete. But they may soon also lose their power. Only when the victims completely assume the features of the ruling civilization will they be capable of wresting them from the dominant power. The only remaining differentiating factor is reduced to naked usurpation. Only in its blind anonymity could the economy appear as fate. Its spell is broken by the horror of the seeing dictatorship. The horror of the seeing dictatorship. The mimicking of the classless society by class society has been so successful that, while the oppressed have all been co-opted, the futility of all oppression becomes manifest. The ancient myth proves to be quite feeble in its new omnipotence. Even if the dynamic at work was always the same, its end today is not the end. End quote. Adorno. Economy, in the sense criticized by Marx, quote, is a special case of bracket economy, end bracket, end quote. Adorno, as a form of domination. Footnote. Translator's note. The original German, Ökonomie ist ein Sonderfall der Ökonomie, economy is a special case of economy, is translated by Rodney Livingstone as, quote, economics is a special case of economizing, end quote. End footnote. This is the rule which knows no exceptions. Quote, while Marx attempted to extrapolate the antagonisms of capitalist society from the dialectics of the rationality of exchange, Horkheimer and Adorno expand these antagonisms in dialectic of enlightenment. Horkheimer and Adorno's decisive turn against Marxian theory, while integrating them into a general dialectics of human self-preservation, which allows them to account for extra-economic elements of domination. End quote. Cogger, 1988. Adorno's article, Reflections on Class Theory, lays the economy theoretical foundation for dialectic of enlightenment. by conceiving of the economy as an element of a meta-economy, which is itself domination, and at times asserts itself in the form of the capital relation. That's the end of chapter 6. Thank you so much for listening.